Hey, you believers, non-believers, unaffiliated believers, sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers. Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where we welcome converts, but where we think like disciples. This is a show where we address things about which today's church is both terrified and silent. And man, with today's topic, is that one ever more on target than ever. With a puffed up 3.5 GPA, I graduated high school in 1980. It should have been 1979, but I had to repeat my junior year, not so much because I was slow, but from a car accident I was in. Though I was then intellectually lazy as a kid, I was happy being a jock. I took the easiest classes possible. And that's how I got to my fluffy GPA. At that time, I gave little thought to attending college. But if you had pulled into our blue-skied Central Oregon high school parking lot, among the 150 or so cars, you would have seen 10 to 15 rigs driven by high school students that had rifles or shotguns mounted in the back of the truck. You could see the rifles right through the cab back window. No laws against having a mounted rifle. And do you know how many school shootings there were during my 14 years of public education? 1. With a .22 caliber rifle, in 5 minutes, a custodian at Cal State Fullerton murdered 7 and wounded 7 more in 1976. Now, across the entire 20th century, there were, in fact, a few school shootings per year, but the overwhelming bulk of those were self-inflicted gunshots, suicides or failed suicides, or it was where there was an angry student who fired a weapon at a teacher or a principal or his girlfriend. But there were hardly any mass shootings. Incidents counted where 4 or more were shot. There were hardly any of those prior to 1999. The first mass school shooting in the second half of the 20th century was on April 20th, 1999 in Columbine, Colorado. Eric Harris, he was 18 years old, he was the cold-blooded mastermind, and Dylan Klebold, who was 17, he was the nervous and depressed understudy. They spent a year plotting how they could kill 500 classmates. As it turned out, in the span of about 40 minutes, wearing BA trench coats, they murdered, the news always reports it as killed, but conspiring to kill is called murder by any standard definition. Harris and Klebold murdered 13 and wounded 20 more before they committed suicide. They had placed a bomb in the school cafeteria, hoping to murder still more. And I remember the incident well. I was an adjunct in Southern California and had students in my class who had just graduated from Columbine. They were in tears, emotionally distraught that could have happened at their alma mater in their dear hometown. The whole nation was shook. It violated all notions of decency. How could high school-age boys commit such an atrocity? How could they possibly have taken such joy in the plotting of it all? And they really were gleeful in planning the whole thing. It was truly devilish. Well, the AP News Agency reports that since Columbine, America has now experienced 14 such mass shootings, defined again as an incident where 4 or more people were shot. In those 14 events...
You mean 140?
No, 14. In those 14 incidents across 22 years, 169 people have died at schools. That's horrible. That's right through the unspeakable incident recently at Uvalde, Texas. So when big media reports that there are multiple such incidents every year, they are lying. The legacy media takes lying as their raison d'etre. It's sickening. But back to guns. So if we went from 1 mass school shooting per decade to, less than 1 per year on average, something has changed. What is it? What's changed? Well, the guns haven't changed. A 9mm handgun is still a 9mm. A 12-gauge shotgun is still a 12-gauge. And schools haven't changed. Well, yes, they actually have in terms of ethos, and that actually might be part of the problem. But the physical space, the configuration of school campusi hasn't changed. So what has changed? That's a question I never hear asked in public media discussions. No, the mantra, the talking point of the progressive, secular, postmodern, godless, post-Christian cultural influencers and the media, you guys, I think of the media as the false prophet for the Antichrist, right? In the Revelation, the book of Revelation, there is this dark, godless beast, and assisting him is the false prophet. There is always a mouthpiece espousing evil. The Revelation, even if it weren't inspired by God, the 2,000-year-old Revelation totes understood how evil works. It always has a propaganda wing, a mouthpiece who stands there straight-faced and lies right to our faces. 2,000 years ago, the Revelation understood that propagandizing is central to the efforts of evil forces, and to me, that's just amazing. And honestly, it's apocalyptic in its own right. But as I was saying, the mantra of our post-Christian cultural influencers is that the problem is the guns. If we could just get rid of the guns, then we wouldn't have these shootings. And it does make some logical sense, right? I mean, true, if there were no guns, there would be no shootings. And if there were no paper, no one would ever get a paper cut. And if there were no rusty nails to step on, we'd hardly even need tetanus shots. But since we had some 200 years of American history with practically zero mass shootings, then we know it actually is not the guns that are the problem. Guns have no moral agency, they have no conscience. Guns are not persons. Sheesh. There's a bumper sticker for you who hate corporations. Guns are not persons. But something has changed, and what that is, I believe, is the root of this problem. But no secular cultural influencer, politician, media star, Ivy League professor, musical star, TV talk show host, no secular cultural influencer for obvious reasons wants to delve into what it is that has changed. And again, what has changed is the culture. As a friend of mine put it, our culture is sick. The breakdown, and it's not an accidental collapse, but it's a breakdown because it's been intentional. The breakdown of the line between good and evil has collapsed. Our culture's moral conscience has been intentionally tossed into the meat grinder, caricatured and mocked and rooted out and torched. But today, I'm not going to delve into the cultural change, my listener. You know what's happened. Every cultural institution, schools, courts, political lobbies, theaters, the FBI, media industries,
Even my indigenous homeland, Disney.
and holy God, in a diabolical turn, even many churches have now become purveyors of a God-evacuated worldview. No, what I want to think through with you today is a Christian framework for understanding self-defense, for understanding human agency, understanding power, for understanding gun ownership, all of that again through a Christian worldview. And yes, I'm interrupting my Spiritual World series to do this. I think it's that critical. It's on everyone's mind right now. So, what? What is the sine qua non of a biblical worldview? I did a whole series on a biblical worldview, but let's agree for starters as a non-negotiable caveat that a biblical worldview begins with, is grounded in, and centers around the person of God. But what I'm asking here is, what is the unqualified element of reality for we humus beings? Here it is. agency. The Bible begins from the get-go with human agency. Adam and Eve are given the agency to represent God as imago Dei, given the agency to perform God's will, given the agency to tend the garden and care for the animals, given the agency as persons to be and live and do according to what God designed for them, or not. Agency. And yes, it is about free will, but even that is to reduce the matter to one of choice, as though this were only about choice. And of course, sure, this is about choice, but it's about much more. It is, in accord with the many episodes I've done now on the Paleo-Hebrew worldview, it's about God's design for us. It's about what we're capable as corporeal, finite, conscious, relational, hungry, beautiful beings. It's about the totality of our lives, agency. What will we do with the 70 years we have on planet Earth? What will we hold out before God on that final day of judgment? What will we show Him we did with the agency with which He created us? And so, agency goes to responsibility. And the whole Bible, every single story, every single book, every single chapter goes to our agency. Did our lives side with God's initiative for us? Or did the totality of our lives side with fallen and dark, anti-godly forces? That is all central to the Bible's worldview. Agency. Agency goes to relationship. What do you do with your relationships? Did you live with fidelity? Do you live with loyalty? To God? To your spouse? Your family? Were you an agent of good to those around you? Agency. Agency goes to purpose. Did you fulfill what God has for you to do? In all of the myriads of ways of fulfilling one's purpose, did you ever stop and ask, Lord, what is it that you want me to be about? How do you want me to use the gifts you've given me? Or did you shirk all of that in a selfish power grab? Agency goes to frequency. Did you live in a way that was wired to the character and goals of God? Did you live in accord with the heartbeat of Christ? Did you express your personhood attuned to the beautiful frequency of the Holy Spirit? Agency. The Bible's emphatic that we all have agency. It teaches again and again that our agency is critical for how we live and move and have our being. And again, God will, in the end, judge our very souls for what we did with our agency. So then, with agency in mind, we have to ask, how do we use our agency? Did we live as victims? Did we blame everyone else for our situation in life? Or did we ever, as an act of dignity and agency, say to ourselves or others or the universe, hey, I'm not going to take this anymore. As much as I have it in me, I'm going to use my agency to better my situation, to better the situation of those around me, to be a blessing and so to be blessed. And all of that is, sorry to be redundant, agency. From the story of Cain and Abel forward, from Cain's murder of Abel, we are asked to consider, in light of our God-given agency, am I my brother's keeper? Genesis 4:9. Am I somehow responsible for how I treat others? And, my listener, I think with only that much unpacked from a sweeping biblical worldview, we can see that moral agency is foundational. It actually does matter to God how we treat others. Morality is woven into the very fabric of the universe. So again, with all of that in mind, we're not one little bit surprised to know that God forbids the murder of others. Taking a gun, or a knife, or an automobile, or a match, or some poison, and using that against the agency of another's person is a sin. The Bible is univocal thereon. And all of that's how to frame it in the negative. But in the positive, Am I my brother's keeper? Also has its obligations. We're not only called by the nature of God, we're not only called to not shoot someone or poison them or burn them or stab them or run them down with a car. We're not only called to not violate their agency, we're positively enjoined by the whole Bible to protect the agency of other persons. There's just nothing in Scripture that teaches us to look the other way when people are being lied to, raped, tortured, manipulated, or murdered. Those who take the Bible to be promoting a pacifistic moral system simply are not reading the Bible carefully or in toto. I agree with the Catholic writer John Zmirak, who wrote, quote, "Any position that asks you to passively watch your spouse or children be raped, enslaved, or killed is intrinsically anti-human. Pacifism is subhuman since it devalues the lives and liberty of every human being, which are simply not worth fighting for." End quote. And then, recounting the historical track of pacifism's blaring errors, author Elizabeth Anscombe said, quote, "Pacifism is not the only thing that has led to a universal forgetfulness of the law against killing the innocent, but it has had a share in it." End quote. And I don't need to persuade you, my listener, that it's woven into our human nature to protect life, to protect our new babies and those we love, our families, our friends, our relationships. God Himself wove that love of life deep down into our souls. And many listening will be wondering right about now, but what about Jesus' statement, "Turn the other cheek"? Well, did you know that when Christ was struck by the guard at his arrest, he rebuked him? John 18:23. Or when Paul was beaten, he warned his attacker of divine judgment and retribution, Acts 23:3. So, did Jesus and Paul violate Jesus' own "turn the other cheek" statement? No. But they did understand it differently than a literal, straightforward exhortation to pacifism. If we study Jesus' remarks in that passage in its context, we'll see that he was, as Father Robert McTeague, a Jesuit, wrote in the journal Aletheia, Jesus was teaching us, quote, "by his words and example, not to collapse in the face of evil, but rather to resist evil while resisting the temptation to hate the evildoer. Turn the other cheek." Loving our enemies and praying for those who persecute us in no way precludes defending the vulnerable and resisting wickedness. And all of that brings us to guns. Guns help us protect our neighbor, our family, our spouses, our country even. Do we all wish we lived in a world where guns were unnecessary? Of course. Wouldn't it be great if there were no bombs, no fighter jets, no tanks, no mortars, night vision binoculars, or grenades? Wouldn't it be sublime if there was not a town in the world that needed a police force? That'd be amazing. No, it would be eschatological. But we do live in a fallen world. And we readers of the Bible, we students of the Bible, soberly realize that human nature is fallen. And we realize that the human soul gets corrupted, spiritually poisoned, and so guns then become necessary. But it's not only a personal matter. And this is where the progressive, secular, post-Christian mindset cannot process. When it's being honest, it only thinks in the immediate. When it's being dishonest, which is 99% of the time, the progressive, secular, postmodern, post-Christian mindset is manipulating us and only thinking about power. Again, it's not only a personal matter, it's a corporate matter. And corporate dimensions always go to power. Always. Well, we'll get to how we apply wisdom to corporate angles in a moment. First, thanks so much for telling your family and friend about this podcast. No, I don't do sermons. Nope. We just think together. And that by itself makes this show unique. A show about Christian worldview? That's cray-cray. But I get so much help promoting the UU from so many people today. Thank you, Scott M., Victor S., Joanna J., Kenneth H., Irene A., and Josh E. for your recent social media love. Thanks. All you need to do, copy and paste the UU Facebook post feed to your own social media app, or you can tell a friend, And to all of that I say, muchas gracias. So then, let's think about corporate layers to human existence. If we study history, and again, the Bible is one big composite picture of human history, if we do that, we realize that governing agencies, precisely because they're led by individuals with fallen hearts, persons with sinful souls, governing agencies themselves are not only befouled by the sin that infects us all, they are also capable of more wounding than are individual people. Right? Again, the Bible shows us, from Genesis, the Tower of Babel, and the Exodus, the Pharaohic regime in Egypt, to the Revelation, Babylon the Great Whore, that corporate power is more adept at systemic wounding than any other entity. Power woven to official status is more capable of wide-sweeping injury than any one person. Official power, under the aegis of official state-sponsored authority, is the greatest force of human suffering on the planet Earth. And that's both today and across all of history. If we added up all of the human misery across all of the millennia of human existence, no thing could hold a match to the misery visited upon humanity by governments. Yes, Mother Nature is a fickle mistress. She can bless us with fresh produce and nourishment, but she can destroy us in a heartbeat. Volcanoes, floods, tsunamis, forest fires, pandemics. Nature can be wildly violent. Even still, nature hasn't wiped out even a flicker of the amount of human beings that governments have. Governments, using the authority of massive agency, have brutalized, starved, enslaved, manipulated, lied to, despoiled, and taken advantage of billions of people. There's really no close second place. So we're not at all surprised to know that the Bible says God will especially judge those whose agency reigned and ruled over the agency of others. To wit, kings, princes, pharaohs, nobles, presidents, senators, congressmen, judges, army generals. Luke 12:48 sums up the whole Bible's perspective on this. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Members of governments should live and serve and manage with more humility. Instead, we see the most grotesque hubris and arrogance from political figures. Why? Sinful human nature. Lord Acton summed it well. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Our leaders have been given so much, you think they should be wary about inflicting pain and suffering. Instead, they think we're all here to serve and obey them, instead of the reverse, them serving their offices to promote the common good. And here in America, knowing all that history about the ability of governmental agencies to brutalize human beings, the founders wisely and intentionally wove into our nation's founding documents as citizens the right, not permission, not begrudging allowance, our right to own guns. Why? Why, of all things, weave gun ownership into the nation's founding documents? Well, again, because they knew. They studiously knew the power of human agency. Embracing godly wisdom, they knew the Bible taught that our agency, being, responsibility, power, was all granted to us by God. God gives us our agency. It's not the state who grants our agency, despite what the progressive, secular, postmodern, post-Christian mindset says to the contrary. You guys, up in Canada, today, here in 2022, here when we're now some 500 years into the history and evolution of Western civilization, there is a Prime Minister who wants to take away Canadian citizens' rights to own guns. Taking emotional advantage of the recent school shootings here in America, Buffalo, Uvalde, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is proposing legislation that will make it illegal to, quote, buy, sell, transfer, or import handguns anywhere in Canada. Trudeau said, we're capping the market for handguns. Gun magazines under the new laws will be restricted to 5 bullets. And even more terrifying, the new legislation would create a red flag law that allows for gun confiscation of individuals if a court deems someone a risk. Man, that sounds like a grand way to confiscate the guns of conservatives, right? Of their political enemies, right? And then a mandatory gun buyback program will begin at the end of 2022. How? How is Trudeau selling this gun grab? Oh, per the usual meme, we will keep you safe. Trudeau persuaded, quote, other than using firearms for sport shooting and hunting, there is no reason anyone in Canada should need guns in their everyday lives. Trudeau said, we need less gun violence. We will, Trudeau said, protect communities. And man, oh man, that's how the wool is pulled over unassuming eyes. We will keep you safe, right? That's how the COVID schlock was baked into the American population's mind. We need to keep you safe, right? Just turn your body over to state care and everyone will be fine. Just turn your critical brains off and trust us, said every tyrant in history. Now, how do we know that Trudeau is lying? Because he'll never give up his own cadre of armed bodyguards. He'll never forsake his right as Prime Minister to be protected by trained bodyguards carrying semi-automatic guns. He will never force his armed entourage to limit their magazine capacities to 5 bullets. He'd never want to disarm the police. So it's all a total ruse. We only mean to keep you safe. It's a lie. There's not a skosh of integrity in those words. So why? Why does a Trudeau or a Joe Biden or a Gavin Newsom want to illegalize and confiscate guns? First, fear. They live in fear. They know that a massive percentage, 60% of the population positively wants to preserve their liberty through the right to own guns. But that fear motivation is far outweighed by an age-old hunger for power. There are, as I've said for 4.5 years of doing this show, there are people who live for power. They utterly hate that we exercise our agency, hate that we plebes exercise an agency that is, to date, still beyond their control. How dare we? Especially when they know what is best for us. Power gives them a soaring adrenaline rush, makes their pulse quicken. The prospects of utter control is about as enticing for that kind of personality profile as anything on earth. Power, power, baby, power. Well, get this. On April 28, 1996, a lone shooter in Tasmania, Australia, murdered 35 people and wounded 23 at a historic 18th century prison site. You can guess what happened next. Yep, within 2 weeks. Anything decided in 2 weeks for a national policy simply has to be insane, right? I've never made an important decision for my life in only 2 short weeks, much less for them to do so for an entire nation in 2 weeks. In 2 short weeks, Australia went about confiscating, buying back, and banning guns. Something like 15 to 20% of all guns were reduced. And again, as we can imagine, the new Australian gun policies were all done under the guise of, we are going to keep you safe now. But wisdom? Do you know how Chairman Mao and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin each gained unqualified power in China, Germany, and Russia? First, by gun confiscation. And first, by, air quotes, promising to establish a peaceful utopia by promising safety. And then, once they'd taken away everyone's guns, they rode roughshod over the entire population. They brutalized tens of millions. They turned their nations into veritable prison camps. Unable to protect their own agency or the agency of their neighbor or the agency of their town, those poor Chinese and German and Russian people were plowed under by the men who had lied to them. We only mean to keep you safe. And we're not surprised that Australia's rate of mass shootings has not slowed by percentage of population since the gun bans were initiated. There weren't many before 1996, and there haven't been many since. But guess what? When COVID hit Aussie land and the power-mongering governmental powers wanted to shut off people's liberties, demand they be vaccinated, and or force them into their homes for as long as those powers wanted, the people were far less able to defend themselves. Their civil liberties existed at the behest of politicians. Gideon Rosner, himself an Aussie, reports that the city of Melbourne was under strict lockdown for over 200 days. Citizens were not allowed to leave their homes for more than 2 hours per day during the COVID mania. He said that a curfew was put in place between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. If you travel farther than 3 miles from one's home was prohibited. Fines for breaching those and sundry subsidiary restrictions range from $1,300 to $15,000 US, end quote. During that COVID mania in Australia, the ability to physically move around was almost entirely eliminated. Local Australian states had draconian policies about re-entry. Overseas travel was prohibited. And again, not surprisingly, the mental health system was overwhelmed by all the people losing their minds during the bureaucratic, politically overburdened, hostile takeover in Australia by people in the government. And with guns all but made illegal, the people were rendered vulnerable to governmental overreach. And America's founders knew that kind of political brutalization was the historical norm, the ubiquitous human propensity to brutalize entire nations under the auspices of, we need to keep everyone safe. And again, they wove the rights to gun ownership into the Constitution. They knew that an armed citizenry was a decided check on overreaching governments. They knew that an armed citizenry would help to put a power-grabbing check, you'd better think it through carefully kind of power check on governments that, air quotes, know what is best for the citizenry. Power. Gun ownership is a check on governmental power grabs. No. Because I taught college for 25 years, I know that there are some listening today who are thinking, oh, Ed, come on, man. America's founders were only approving of owning a musket. They never imagined we'd own easy-fire handguns. They never in their wildest imaginations thought we'd one day own semi-automatic rifles. Well, first, to answer that, I'm not convinced they were that unimaginative. They really did think this through. And second, If the founders were incapable of imagining semi-automatic rifles, they also never imagined governments owning attack helicopters mounted with high-powered machine guns, or governments that own GPS-guided aerial bombing fighter jets. They also never imagined or wanted to imagine a post-20th century planet where godless governments had slaughtered some 350 million people. World War I, World War II, the Holocaust, China and Russia. And all of that was done in every instance to help us all move toward utopia. This is just historical wisdom. So, I don't think semi-automatic rifles are any match for the weaponry our government possesses today. And still, I cherish. As a Christian, I cherish. As an American citizen, I cherish. As a published theologian, I cherish the right to own guns. I love that power-mongering governmental officials have to assess, have to consider, as they lay in bed and dream of total power, just what would door-to-door fighting look like if we tried to move through the 50 states of an armed citizenry. That's all good by me. Our collective agency is a good check on their militarily armed agency, on their increasingly insane power grabs. Peter Navarro, that attorney for Hillary Clinton, he gets off scot-free. Peter Navarro gets arrested by the January 6th Commission. This is nuts. Power is being wielded against the citizenry like never before, and the founders knew all of that was possible. And to those founders I say, brilliant, mates, brilliant. And still more, you may be listening, thinking to yourself, come on, Ed, you're so over the top. The American government would never use its power against its own citizenry. Stop being so darned rash. Well, to that I say COVID. And to that I say Twitter, Facebook. Because all of that was used for over 2 years now to lie to and divide and propagandize the American citizenry. Oh, I'm being unfair? How many families are today divided because some got the injection and others refused? How many people lost their jobs for refusing the jab? COVID and the fear-porning that has gone with it for over 2 years led to a devastating breakdown in the trust, in our nation's trust of the entire medical industry. Guys, remember, they quarantined the healthy. They did their best to strip the rights of the healthy.
You will wear a mask when outside. You will only shop at governmentally approved stores. You will comply. Will comply.
They quarantine the healthy. Are you freaking kidding me? And then it's going to take years, decades even, to learn how many people have died early deaths from cancer and blood clots from the injections. Big pharma industry and their bought and paid for minions in the halls of government will do their best to keep those skeletons buried. And really? Our cultural influencers didn't do all they could to sway the 2019 presidential election? Give me a break. Joe simply would not have won if the American population knew he had grifted money through his son, if Hunter Biden's laptop information had been allowed to become public. The Canadian Post-Millennial News reports that 16% of Biden voters, not just the general population, but Biden voters, would have voted differently if the Hunter laptop story had not been suppressed by social media and big tech. 16% of 81 million is 13 million votes. And man, it's hard to imagine, which is exactly why the Hunter Biden laptop story was suppressed. It's hard to imagine 13 million more votes going to Donald Trump. Those kind of power grabs, grotesque manipulations of science and the suppression of information for the sake of political expediency, those kind of power grabs just recently characterized our nation. But you think they wouldn't run roughshod over the citizenry once we were stripped of our ability to defend ourselves against violence? They will abort a baby right up to and through the moment of birth, but they'd leave you alone? Come on, man. Anyone who thinks so highly of our federal government as to grant them absolute physical power over us, whether the government is on the left or the right, is either willfully naive or simply hasn't studied human nature. It's just human nature. Americans are not essentially different from Germans or Russians or the Chinese. It's all the same fixed, corporeal, finite, conscious, relational, hungry stuff. And me, I don't believe we're all doomed to repeat history, but I do believe human nature has certain fixed qualities to it. And I believe in human nature because the Bible does. The Bible teaches that there is not one who hasn't sinned. So, true, there are no verses about guns in the Bible, but there are scores of verses about agency and evil and human nature and wisdom, scores of verses about the importance of exercising wisdom. But then, if, like the post-Christian secularists, you don't believe in human nature or don't esteem historical wisdom, then you have a real hard time addressing something like the question of gun rights. Lord, have mercy on our nation. Lord, have mercy on so many who suffer, and Lord, have mercy on a citizenry that is steadily, gradually, incrementally, notch, being stripped of its own civil rights. Thank you so much for listening, for joining me. Until next time, please go now, everyone, and turn your beautiful, God-given brains on.